There are moments in a man's life when the pillars of reason begin to tremble, when the outer world loses its luster, and the only light left comes from within. But it is not a comforting light. It is an ancestral fire, red and primordial. In 1913, Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, disciple of Freud, and one of the greatest names in modern psychology, broke away from everything that had made him respectable. He abandoned science like a castaway leaves dry land, not out of madness, but out of fidelity to something deeper, the soul itself. For years, Jung plunged into a state of controlled delirium. It wasn't schizophrenia. It was a voluntary journey into the unconscious, a descent guided by symbols, archetypes, and voices from beyond the mind. He called this process active imagination, and the result was a book he hid from the world until after his death. Heavy tome, bound in red leather, handwritten and hand-illustrated like an alchemical grimoire. Inside it, there was no theory, only revelation. The Red Book was not a work about psychology. It was an initiation, the gospel according to the soul. Carl Gustav Jung, at the peak of his career, stood as director of the Berg-Holzli Clinic, Freud's protege and a renowned lecturer. Science celebrated him. Society listened to him, and his ego was well dressed. Yet beneath the surface, something began to crack. Strange images appeared in his dreams. Red Sea rising, covering cities, blood running through silent streets, towers collapsing, deaths without names. Reason wavered. He took notes, observed, and waited for it to pass. It didn't. In 1913, as Europe unknowingly approached the outbreak of World War I, Jung foresaw the coming devastation, not with his intellect, but with his spirit. This vision came at a high personal price. It was like being dragged to the bottom of the sea by an invisible god, as he would later write. His break with Freud was not just intellectual, it was symbolic. Jung was shattering the mechanistic view of the psyche. He no longer sought to treat the soul as a problem to solve, but as a guide to follow. Then came the darkness, not ordinary sadness, but the dark night of the soul. It wasn't depression. It was dissolution, a collapse of the self, a necessary inner shipwreck so that something deeper could emerge. During this phase, Jung discovered active imagination, a method blending dreaming and meditation, where he allowed images to arise spontaneously and consciously interacted with them. He would sit and record what he saw, not inventing, but documenting, like a prophet or scribe of another reality. Characters emerged from his unconscious and spoke to him. Elijah, the Old Testament prophet; Salome, the biblical dancer; a serpent god; a laughing demon; a golden child, and a bodiless voice. Everything was documented and illustrated. These visions shook him, and he questioned his sanity. But something inside assured him that he was being guided, that this was a necessary initiation. Whoever descends into hell returns with fire in their eyes. At that moment, Carl Jung, the man, died, and the initiate was born, the seeker, the alchemist of the soul. He left academia's comfort and dove into what the ancients called the opus magnum, the great inner work. No certainties, no glory, no map, lay a blank notebook and the courage to get lost, to find something greater during this period. Jung wrote that his life was the story of the self-realization of the unconscious. The Red Book began to take form. In this void, each page a ritual, each drawing a vision, each word an offering. Jung underwent a true shamanic process, a pattern seen in mystics and saints. The breakdown of ordinary personality so that higher consciousness might emerge. Perhaps that's why he never published the Red Book during his lifetime. He knew the world wouldn't understand. How could a rationalist audience accept that his greatest leap forward had come by getting lost? But initiates understand before. The light, there is night, and true wisdom is not conquered, but suffered. The cries of the unconscious are sacred chants for those with ears to hear. Amidst these visionary journeys, a central figure emerged, Philemon. He was not a consciously invented character, but appeared autonomously during active imagination. A vision, Jung saw an old man in a blue robe with kingfisher wings and a long white beard who began to speak, not as a hallucination, but as a living presence. By this time, Jung had deeply immersed himself in myths, religions, alchemical symbols, and Eastern spiritual practices, seeking a language for the vast human psyche. And now, instead of mere concepts, a presence appeared, someone he could converse with, question, and learn from. Philemon represented the archetype of the wise old man, present in myths, fairy tales, and spiritual traditions across the world. Laozi in Taoism, the divine logos in Christian mysticism, the hidden elder in the Kabbalah. He embodied transcendental intelligence guiding the individual toward wholeness. Jung understood Philemon was not real in a physical sense, but neither was he imaginary. He called him an autonomous psychic realitia, living force within the psyche that behaved like an independent person with its own thoughts and wisdom beyond Jung's ego. Philemon conveyed thoughts to him that he had never previously considered. Jung knew he was dealing with something both part of him and far beyond him. Philemon was not just a symbolic counselor, but a key guide in individuation, the process by which a human integrates the total psyche, including shadow, anima, animus, and ultimately the self. Philemon was the mediator between ego and self, guiding Jung from chaos to unity. Such guides appear throughout esoteric traditions. In Hermeticism, Hermes Trismegistus plays a similar role. In alchemy, Mercury unites opposites. In Jungian psychology, Philemon took on this role as a dynamic symbol of wisdom arising when the rational mind goes silent. Jung even wrote letters to Philemon as though exchanging correspondence with an invisible intelligence. He demanded inner honesty, refusing to accept experiences that couldn't withstand scrutiny. With Philemon, he admitted to encountering something beyond rational understanding and other within his psyche. Many of Jung's core psychological concepts, like the collective unconscious, archetypes, the transcendent function, and synchronicity, took shape through these dialogues. He later described the Red Book as the raw material from which everything else emerged. For 7 years, Jung chronicled his experiences, drawing Philemon multiple times, always portraying him with penetrating eyes and symbols such as fish, serpents, and the six-pointed, star-soteric emblems of spiritual transformation. Philemon also had an ethical role. When Jung's ego inflated, Philemon brought him back to humility, reminding him that true wisdom does not seek power or recognition, but integration and truth. The danger lies not in the shadow, but in the man who believes he is only light. In an era where people seek external guides and systems, Jung shows that the most powerful guide already dwells within us. To meet it, one must silence the ego, confront the shadow, and allow the unconscious to speak. Jung's encounter with Philemon is not a fantasy, but an archetypal stage in spiritual development. Each of us, when courageously exploring our psyche, may encounter a similar voice, personal inner guide leading us to our true self. Jung simply had the honesty to document it. Old Manet is a map of psychological and spiritual initiation, open to anyone who dares to listen to silence and embrace the strange. From the outside, Jung's descent into the unconscious might seem like a purely spiritual journey, and in many ways it was. But true spirituality for Jung began not with light, but with decatha, putrefaction of the soul, the descent and symbolic death of the ego. This is where Jung's most misunderstood concept emerges: the shadow. The shadow contains everything. The ego refuses to see in its self-repressed desires, aggressive impulses, forbidden fantasies, shame, traumas, but also lost potential, courage, and strengths buried long ago. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean destroying evil, but accepting what was exiled. Jung didn't just observe the shadow, he dialogued with it. He faced demonic figures, death, cannibalism, madness, and dissolution of self. Some of his experiences resemble shamanic visions or entheogenic purges, yet everything happened in full waking consciousness through active imagination alone. Jung's path was not one of escape, but radical confrontation with the unknown depths within. In this abyss, he experienced the symbolic death of the old self, allowing something vaster and more complete to emerge. This was the price Jung paid to witness everything that had been repressed, not only as an individual man, but as a reflection of civilization itself. What he faced was not just his personal shadow, but the hidden side of humanity as a whole. Everything we refuse to confront within ourselves, Jung observed, eventually returns to us as fate. He recorded dialogues with these inner shadow figures. One of them tried to seduce him with promises of absolute power. Another dragged him into a desert of lifelessness. At one point, he even encountered the devil himself, sarcastic figure with hollow eyes. These figures were not random hallucinations, but symbolic forces demanding his surrender, urging him to accept that he was simply another human being, full of contradictions and desires. They called him to abandon any illusion of purity and to stop running from his own darkness. This confrontation marked the core of his baptism in the abyss, the necessary death of the ego. Modern culture, and even much of contemporary spirituality, often encourages us to seek only the positive aspects of our inner lives, healing, peace, and light. But for Jung, any path to enlightenment that ignores the shadow is fundamentally false. Like the ancient alchemists, he understood that the great work begins with nigredo, the black night of the soul. Symbolic death and decomposition of the false self. Individuation, he said, always begins with a wound. For Jung, this wound was twofold: the collapse of his social identity. He was no longer the celebrated doctor of Switzerland, the disintegration of his rational ego, with its familiar controls and certainties. He wrote obsessively, painted chaotic images, wept, and sat in silence for hours. It was as if he were being initiated by a force that permitted no inner lies. Despite the intense emotional turmoil, Jung did not surrender to pure delirium. He approached his experiences methodically, taking notes, observing, classifying, and comparing what arose with ancient myths, Gnostic texts, medieval alchemy, Eastern scriptures, and the dreams of his own patients. What he realized was profound. His journey was not unique, but archetypal. It followed a universal pattern found in myths across cultures: the descent into the underworld. The Greeks called it katabasis. The alchemists called it putrefaxio, and in the tarot, it is represented by the card of death. This stage offers no comforting answers, only the ruin of all false constructs of self. Stone by stone, Jung watched his constructed identity collapse. The man who once controlled the psyche was now a pilgrim with no solid ground beneath his feet. As he faced the darkness, something unexpected began to happen. The more he confronted his shadow, the more consciousness seemed to emerge. Out of the chaos, a new center began to form. The shadow, far from being a malevolent enemy, revealed itself as a mere necessary guide toward wholeness. Through this harrowing process, Jung approached an idea that had previously only existed as abstract philosophy: the self. This was not merely an intellectual concept, but a direct, living experience of total psychintegrating both the conscious and unconscious, the light and the darkness, the persona and the essence. The self is not reached through rational striving, but through surrender, by crossing the abyss and emerging transformed. Rebirth is gradual, arriving like clarity after a storm, a light that reveals rather than blinds. Jung began to recognize patterns, to draw mandalas, and to sense a deep, natural order behind the seeming chaos. The soul had its own rhythm. The shadow was not a mistake. It was part of the journey. Years later, Jung would summarize this understanding with a powerful phrase: salvation is in the mud. The pearl is born in the sludge. Jung shows us that true healing of the soul doesn't come from denying what is ugly, dark, or rejected, but from making peace with it and building something real out of it. The Red Book, which Jung completed around 1930, did not mark the end of his journey, but rather its true beginning. The book served not as a conclusion, but as a portal. He had undergone the ego's collapse, dialogued with the voices of the unconscious, found an inner master, and traversed the full depth of the shadow. He emerged without definitive answers, but with a new way of seeing reality's living symbol. The Red Book became the record of his initiation. For decades, the Red Book remained locked away by Jung's family. It was a manuscript of nearly 200 pages on thick parchment, covered with careful calligraphy and powerful, often unsettling, symbolic illustrations. Jung himself admitted that the book was not for everyone. He knew that it contained not a psychological theory, but something far more primal, a gospel of the soul. Not in the religious sense, but as revealed teaching about the hidden laws that govern the psyche and the path toward wholeness. The format and symbolism of the book resembled medieval grimoires and hermetic manuscripts rather than academic texts. This was no accident. Jung was deeply versed in alchemical traditions, European esotericism, and mystical literature. He named the book Liber Novus, the new book, and structured it according to a ritualistic initiatory sequence. Its 3 parts: the way of what is to come, the soul, and the 7 sermons to the dead mirrored ancient spiritual initiation systems, such as Kabbalah, Orphic mysteries, and Egyptian rites. The Red Book's pages were filled with mandala symbols of the self, of psychic order, serpents, labyrinths, God's eyes, solar crosses, winged creatures. These were not random drawings, but images drawn from the collective unconscious, from the symbolic vocabulary shared by all humanity. At times, Jung wrote like a prophet, at others, like an alchemical initiate. He addressed the soul as a real being, not metaphorically, but with direct solemnity. For this reason, the Red Book often feels less like something to be analyzed and more like something to be experienced. As Jung himself said, "This book freed me from all my neurosis. I wrote it with blood." In the decades that followed, Jung continued to develop the theoretical framework that emerged from this visionary experience, concepts such as archetypes, individuation, the collective unconscious, and the transcendent function. To express the depth of what he had lived, he turned to alchemy. He recognized in medieval and Renaissance alchemical texts like the Rosarium Philosophorum, Aurora Consurgens, and the works of Paracelsa, symbolic language for the psyche. Alchemy was not primitive chemistry, but symbolic psychology. The alchemists were not just attempting to transmute metals, they were charting the transformation of the soul. Jung merely deciphered their esoteric language and adapted it into modern psychological terms, creating one of the most remarkable bridges between science and mysticism. As he once said, "Alchemy is the historical background of my psychology." One of the most enigmatic sections of the Red Book is the 7 Sermons to the Dead. Written in 1916 and attributed not to himself, but to Basilite, a 2nd century Gnostic mystic. In these sermons, Jung channeled a voice that spoke of pleroma, the divine fullness of Abraxas, the God who transcends good and evil, and of ultimate dualities and transcendence. These sermons are not rational discourses, but symbolic revelations, fusing Gnostic cosmology, existential ethics, and metaphysics of the unconscious. They read like an ancient oracle or mystical scripture. In these moments, Jung seemed no longer merely an author, but a vessel for something beyond himself. The Red Book fully reveals itself here as an initiatory text, far more than a personal diary. It remained unpublished for nearly 80 years, finally released to the public in 2009. Since then, it has attracted not only psychologists, but mystics, artists, philosophers, theologians, and seekers from all over the world. It has been compared to works like the Divine Comedy, the Zohar, the Bhagavad Gita, and Plato's Dialogues. But unlike those, the Red Book is radically personal. It offers no universal doctrine or system. Instead, it is a raw, intimate portrait of the struggle to become whole. Perhaps its greatest power lies here. It shows that it is possible to dialogue with the unconscious without being consumed by it. There is method to the descent, a map within the abyss. For many, encountering the Red Book activates something within a deep resonance. Reading it is not an intellectual exercise, but a confrontation with one's own soul. It stirs the voice that has long been ignored, yet never fully silenced. Jung reminds us that within each person dwells a vast, mysterious inner world, a forest, a temple, a chaos, a god. And as he taught, the soul exists sand. It wants something from you. If the Red Book is a gospel, it does not offer salvation, but invites us into the journey. If you, like Jung, have the courage to enter the darkness without a map, you may also discover your own guide, your own self, your true face. If you follow this far, you begin to see that the Red Book is not merely about Jungians, about you, about all of us, about that ineffable thing we call the soul, which continues calling even when the world demands silence. This is not an explanation, it is an invitation. Close your eyes, listen,